Hey everybody, welcome to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. We got a great show. This is part 2 of mold that we're going to be talking about today. If you missed last week, you can go back and watch that replay. We can put a link up for you here if you missed it. It's important. I want you to stay with us. I'm going to be talking about some of the things we talked about last week, but some of them in a little bit more detail. So tonight, stay with me. We're going to be talking about the 3 ways that mold can actually deteriorate your health and what you need to look out for. If you suspect mold, if you're not sure whether or not mold is playing a role, we're going to be talking a lot tonight about what to look for and what tests that you can ask your doctor to run to help you understand this. So stay with me all the way through. And if you're new to the show, make sure understand the rules. First come, first serve. Ask your questions early. I'll answer them as they come in. Try to keep them topic related. If they're not too topic related, I might just skip them altogether. So try to keep them on topic for the show, which again is mold toxicity. So again, welcome to the show. Let's dive in. So talking about ways that mold can destroy your health. And so to start this off, let's talk about when you might want to suspect mold as being a major player in your health. So there's some key symptoms and some key tests that we want to consider if we want to suspect mold. And one of them, it's a very, very common one, is burning mouth and burning tongue. So if you struggle with burning mouth and burning tongue, if that's a symptom that you have and you don't know why, this is a very, very common side effect of chronic mold and mycotoxin exposure. So burning sensation. We also sometimes see this burning neuropathy in the face. So extreme facial pain or burning neuropathy in the face. One of the hallmark symptoms commonly seen in people with mold issues. We'll also see a hypersensitivity to supplements, not just supplements, but to chemical odors as well. So supplements, chemicals. So if you're reactive to perfumes, soaps, lotions, you get in a cab and they've got one of those little air fresheners dangling, right? And it gives you a migraine headache. Very, very common to see people with mold issues being hypersensitive to chemicals and supplements. But in particular, with the hypersensitivity to supplements, generally what we'll see is if the supplement supports or enhances methylation. Methylation is a chemical process in your body. It's actually a detoxification pathway. And a lot of times when people get on supplements that enhance methylation, they find that their symptoms become worsened, meaning they don't feel better supplementing, they actually feel worse. So hypersensitivity to supplements or other chemicals. Oftentimes, too, we'll see oxalate elevation. So what is an oxalate? An oxalate is a chemical that we can measure for, right? And so oftentimes in the urine, it's important if you're asking your doctor to measure this, that you ask him to measure a 24-hour urine collection for oxalate. Now, oxalate is a chemical byproduct that some molds can actually produce. It's actually been shown that, for example, aspergillus, which is a type of mold that can live in your home, can actually produce oxalate. And we'll see oxalate being higher in people that are in mold. Now, it's important a distinction to make because not everybody in mold is going to have high oxalate and not everybody with high oxalate is going to be in a moldy environment. But it's one of those clues that we sometimes will look for if we're trying to piece it together. So if you've got an oxalate elevation, it can be mold, but it can also be chronic antibiotic use. A lot of people that have chronic antibiotic use, there's certain bacteria that help break oxalate down. Remember, we eat oxalates in our food. Spinach is rich in oxalate. Almonds are rich in oxalate. A lot of foods have high oxalate content. And if you don't have the microbiome to break oxalate down, if you don't have healthy bacteria that can break oxalate down, you can also have an elevation in your urine oxalate output over a 24-hour cycle of time. And then again, understand that yeast overgrowth inside of you can also potentially produce higher levels of oxalates. So you could be eating high oxalate foods. You could have a yeast overgrowth inside of you. You could also have a mold issue in the external environment. So oxalate can mean more than just mold, but it's one of those things that we look for that clues us in. Another one is low white blood cells, low red blood cells, and low platelets. So if you've gone to the doctor year after year, you don't know why your white counts are always low or your red counts are always low or you're always anemic, this is one of the common areas that mold can affect. Mold can impact. One of the ways that mold does is particularly the mycotoxins themselves. The mycotoxins that mold produces will inhibit DNA synthesis. And so this goes back to when you're trying to produce new red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. If you've got that inhibition happening, then oftentimes we'll see those low white counts showing up early. I've seen a lot of people that have come to see me over the years, and they've been to the hematologists, and they've had all the different types of bone marrow problems and cancers ruled out, and oftentimes we'll find mold as a primary driving issue behind why this can happen. Another one that can be, so these, again, this is a simple blood test, right? If you ask your doctor here, you can ask for a simple CBC. CBC stands for complete blood count, and all three of these markers are present on a standard CBC that any doctor can order. Your histamine levels, increased histamine or an histamine intolerance is another sign oftentimes. There's a condition called MCAS. We kind of briefly touched on it last week, but mast cell activation syndrome, we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but if you have a histamine intolerance, and there's a couple different reasons why. One, we'll see histamine intolerance because you could be allergic to mold, and so if you're allergic to the mold that you're being exposed to, your IgE responses go up, driving histamine levels, which can cause, over time, increases in histamine can cause a lot of different types of chemical disruption, predominantly inflammation, but also an intolerance. So there are certain foods that have histamine in them, or that help to increase levels of histamine. And so an intolerance to those types of foods, or the symptoms of increased histamine, which you can measure. This is another one. This can be measured. It can be measured in the blood. You can measure histamine levels. You can also measure another compound that helps with histamine called tryptase. That's another compound that can be measured. So you can ask your doctor to measure your histamine and your tryptase levels. And if they're low, again, this is, and oftentimes this is something that we see in people with mold issues. We'll also see high ferritin levels. Ferritin, when ferritin is elevated, it's oftentimes a sign that the liver is being damaged. So high ferritin, same thing here with increased AST, that should be an ALT, not an AFT, but an ALT. Those are two lab tests of two lab tests that measure for liver functionality, and if they come back elevated chronically, you can suspect mold among other toxins. But high ferritin, AST, and ALT, alanine aminotransferase and aspartate aminotransferase are all potentials for mold damage. Because why? Because mycotoxins have to be biotransformed through the liver, and it puts a lot of pressure on the liver, and we'll see the liver take on damage when that occurs. Another issue is a decrease GFR. That GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. This is a sign or a marker that the kidneys are slowing down and that the kidneys' function is reducing. And this is common because some of the mycotoxins, the mold poisons, directly can damage your kidneys. And so by damaging your kidneys, your ability to filter, your kidney's ability to filter decreases. And that's what GFR is measuring. It's measuring that kidney filtration rate. So if all of these things are matching and all of your doctors have said, we really don't know why your mouth burns and you're oversensitive to chemicals and that you have abnormal low counts of white blood cells or platelets, et cetera, because most doctors won't measure your oxalate or your histamine. They just won't. It won't be a standard course of tests that they run. What typically does get run, it's like your ferritin is a common one that gets run. Your AST and ALT commonly get run. Your GFR commonly gets run, and your CBC commonly gets run. Like, these are the ones that if you get a general checkup, most doctors are going to run these as a standard course, whereas oxalate, not so much. Histamine and tryptase, not so much. Sometimes you got to request those. But again, if these are coming back abnormal and you're chronically tired and you struggle with gastrointestinal symptoms, joint symptoms, brain fog, or neurological problems, then you want to think about mold as a primary potential possibility. Now, especially this last one here, if you have a history in your home of either two things: water intrusion, meaning that you've had a roof leak or a busted pipe or a major spill, like a waterbed broke, a fish tank shattered, something like that, where you've had major spillage, right? Or if you've had previous remediation. If you're near the coast like myself, when you get hurricanes and floods, remediation, when those types of things happen, they got to come in and clean up the water damage. And so if you may have had where somebody has come out and cleaned up the damage, they didn't find mold, they cleaned up the damage early enough, but they didn't clean it up well enough. And that can be a breeding ground for mold. So if that's happened to you and you experience all these other things, you definitely want to start leaning toward mold as a thought process. Now, there are other tests, and I talked about some of those last week. The reason I'm talking about these things this week is because these are things that if your doctor's not a mold expert and you're just watching this show trying to figure it out, these are things most doctors will run. They're not going to tell you, no, I'm not going to run that. So these are just tools I'm trying to give you that might give you some insight as to try to put things together and be your own kind of sleuth or detective, if you will, when your doctor maybe isn't trying to help you very much. Now, there are some other definitive tests, as I mentioned last week, and one of the things that you can run or that you can have measured is your mycotoxin levels. And that's pretty darn definitive. If you have high levels of mycotoxins, you've got a mold problem. And so that's one. But if your doctor's not willing to order it, again, these are common things. So sometimes you have to start where you're at and you have to get your doctor to do what they'll do. Okay, so let's see here. Let's move it over. Let's move this over because I'll talk about that in a minute. So other places for mold exposure. Let's talk about some of where do you get mold from? So most people, when thinking about mold, they're thinking about mold in the home. So there's water leak or water damage. But I want to also bring up to your attention that there are some foods and some things associated with food that can also increase your exposure. And my experience is that it's not generally, these things are not usually what make a person sick, so much as that a person starts to not be able to tolerate these things when they're in mold. And so it's because these foods generally can have high levels of mold and mycotoxins in them. And in the US, some of your mycotoxins, there are rules where we have a certain upper limit of mycotoxins that are allowed in some foods. But for example, some types of mycotoxins, for example, ochratoxin A, which is a type of mold toxin that is produced by a mold called Aspergillus, there's no set limit. So they don't even test for it in the US. Now in European nations they do, but in the US we don't even test for it here, which blows my mind because it's one of the most dangerous mycotoxin carcinogenic compounds that causes cancer. But these foods, coffee, peanuts, grains, which is, remember, no grain, no pain. Why do we talk about not just no gluten, no pain? We talk about no grain. One of the reasons why is high contamination of mold and mycotoxins of grains. Alcohol, what is alcohol made out of? For most, alcohols are made out of grain, right? And so you get contaminated grains producing a contaminated beverage. But this is especially also true with wine. There have been a number of research studies showing that mycotoxin levels are above the limitation set as standards. And especially this is true of red wines. The longer you store them, the greater the potential as well. So alcohol is a big one. A lot of people, what happens, they're in mold and they drink their whole life. They've had a glass of wine or they've had some alcohol, and then once they start getting in mold, they find, wow, why can I not have a glass of wine without being wrecked for the next day or for the next week? So if you find yourself where you've had an entire lifelong ability to tolerate these things, and then you hit a point where you can no longer tolerate them, and it's across the board, you might start thinking at mold as a potential, because these are all foods that are commonly contaminated with mold and mycotoxins. So sometimes it's what you're exposed to in your environment, and sometimes it's what you eat directly. But again, alcohol, soybeans, fruit juice, grains, peanuts, and coffee. Now, one of the other things that we'll see is there's these coffee machines with the pods. You see these, right? And so they have like a water chamber in them, and you put the water in and it pulls it through a tube, heats the water up, and you know, the pod, basically the water runs through that pod and creates your beverage, your coffee. The machines themselves, these pods are used in, oftentimes can be contaminated with mold. I've actually seen a few cases where the mold was in the machine and it was making a person sick. The other thing we'll see oftentimes is water bottles. When you have a water bottle with a very narrow lid or opening, and it's like so like for example, the bottle is shaped more like where it narrows on its way up, and so you might drink that water, and so it's this area right here, it's hard to clean. This area right here is hard to clean, and you sometimes will see mold growing in these types of water bottles. So you've got to be cautious and really make sure you have good water bottle cleaning hygiene, because if you're not using plastic water bottles and just throwing away the bottle every time, you know, you want to just make sure you're cleaning out your water bottle really, really well, making sure. I've seen cases where people had mold contaminated water bottles. Not a good thing, because now you're drinking the mold in your water. So again, these are just other areas where I've seen people get exposure. These are all foods where people can get exposure to molds and mycotoxins as well. Okay, we also sometimes will see exposure in vehicles, in cars, right? And one of the things that happens is unfortunate, but in the car industry, you get a major flood or you get a big hurricane that comes through, and you have a lot of cars that are water damaged, right? They were trapped on the intersection. The water came up and flooded the car out. Well, what happens to those cars? A lot of them get sold and they go to auctions. They clean them up, but they don't get the mold out of them, and then they turn them right back around to used car lots and they start selling them to people. So people can pick up these flood damaged vehicles that can be sources of mold. So flood damage is a common problem in the car industry itself. And you've got, depending on your vehicle, if you've got kids, sometimes kids spill stuff, right? And so I generally, in my car, I don't like kids drinking or eating in it, because, kids are kind of messy, right? So you get those spills, those big spills into the carpet, right? What happens? For mold to grow, you only really need moisture, and you need some kind of mold food like glue or debris, cellulose, and you need about 48 hours. So your kid spills a big soda, right? It's full of sugar on your carpet in your back of your car, and guess what? Now you got a huge mold fest that's going to happen in that car. So spills are a major reason why. And the two people that own convertibles, if there's a greater potential for a roof leak that can come in, and so you can get water coming into the vehicle consistently when the weather changes, and so the vehicle itself might be a source. There's one more on this, and that's the air conditioner. Sometimes those things, and especially if you live in a hot area, those air conditioners, humidity, you get moisture trapped in those, and so that if you turn on your AC and you can smell must or mold, you got a problem. You got a mold problem in your air conditioner. And if you live in a place like Texas where it gets really, really hot in the summer, and every time you get in your car, you're blasting yourself with moldy air, that could be a potential problem for you. So again, be aware that the vehicles are sometimes a source of exposure. Now then we come to water damaged buildings. Water damaged buildings are common, and water damage happens in more ways than what most people realize. So most people, when they think of water damage, they think of flood, leaks, roof leak, a flood, water coming into the home itself from the outside, pipes busting, that kind of thing. Like, those are common. ACs are leaking. But a lot of times where we see an issue is right here. And I put a couple of stars by this one, because this I see happening more and more commonly because of the speed at which homes are being built today. Homes are going up in 3 to 4 months. A lot of it is wet wood, and then they're drying in sheetrock around wet wood. And so what do you got? You got sheetrock, which is food. You got moisture in the wood itself, and you've got a perfect habitat for mold to grow. So that's an example of a construction issue. I've seen construction issues where the HVAC systems were installed improperly, and so you had condensation forming on the coils, creating a source of moisture that mold could grow. I've seen it where a construction issue where they put a vent, so like a dryer vent, actually dryer vent not going into the main vent, but just a dryer vent going right into the wall, right into the wall itself. I've seen that where they've hooked up dryers where they just cut a hole in the sheetrock and shoved the dryer vent right into the sheetrock, driving all that moisture from drying your clothes directly into the wall. So that's an example of a construction defect. Hooking up fans like moisture fans in the bathroom improperly. I've seen those where they're just blowing the moist air directly into your attic. And that, again, those are just construction defects. One of the things, if you're buying a new home or a used home, either one, is you want to hire an inspector. Obviously, most people do. It's in a lot of places, it's pretty standard practice, but you want to hire an inspector. That's one, hire an inspector to protect your asset. Two, hire a mold inspector to look at the home for potential for construction issues around the possibility for mold to grow. And a mold inspector will also do things like measure humidity. If the house doesn't control humidity well, and this is common when the AC units are oversized, the humidity in the home will not be properly controlled. It goes up, you increase the risk for mold growing. Anything over 55% humidity increases the risk for mold to propagate and grow. So, again, these are common types of issues. There's 1,000 possibilities here, but if you're looking at purchasing a home, whether it's new or used, these are two people that I would highly encourage you to go in, because a lot of the homes today, they do have mold issues. They're just kind of covering them up. And it's my opinion that mold infestation of our infrastructure is one of the top health problems that we face in industrialized countries, period. It's one of the biggest health crises that we're facing right now. So these are examples, but again, we talked a little bit more in depth about mold inspection last week, and you go back and review that. So now let's talk about ways that mold can increase or cause damage. So there's three primary drivers of how mold can damage or destroy your health. And one is through the production of chemicals. Mold produces these byproducts called mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are direct poisons, okay? And the primary driver behind how they make people sick is the inhibition of DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis. And so why is that? Why would that make a person sick? You can't heal. If you can't make new DNA, RNA, and protein efficiently, you can't make new tissue. You can't repair tissue. You can't take inflamed tissue that's damaged and effectively heal and repair it. And so your body just ages faster. It degrades faster. One of the other things that mycotoxins have been shown as direct poisons is they're oxidants. They're free radicals. And so they can age your tissue or damage your tissue. Mold poison mycotoxin has been kind of associated with the same type of damage as low dose radiation. If you look at low dose radiation exposure and health symptoms, look up mold toxicity right next to it. You're going to find a lot of the same symptoms. It's because when you have antioxidants, or rather oxidants, sucking up all of your antioxidants, creating accelerated damage, this is what low dose radiation can do over time as well. So they look very, very similar, but as a direct poison, they cause free radical damage leading to oxidation, which burns through your antioxidant status and really can damage you over time. Basically, it accelerates the aging process. This is why some people in mold feel like they're aging aggressively, right? And again, one of the big areas that we'll see mistaken with age is eyesight. When you're in mold, your vision deteriorates, and one of the reasons why is mycotoxin exposure. Eyesight deterioration is very, very common. It's one of the things we see sometimes happen first, where somebody's like, I'm turning 45, maybe my vision's just getting old and I'm not seeing as well. No, now I'm not saying that age can't affect vision, but if you have had great eyesight and then all of a sudden your eyesight starts to deteriorate, you really want to think here because of the damage happening to the eye. Now, so that's one way, is mycotoxins, right? Mycotoxins can affect you. Number two is when you have this immunosuppression, because this is part of what happens from the mycotoxins, it can lead to number two. Now, you don't have to have immunosuppression to get to number two, but oftentimes this is part of how it propagates, is mycotoxins suppress your immune system, allowing for yeast overgrowth to occur in different areas of your tissue. So sinus cavities, oral cavity, GI tract, vaginal, and skin are areas where we'll commonly see yeast overgrowth occur in people that are in immunosuppressed and in chronic mold, because a lot of the yeast that we're already exposed to is part of our microbiome, and if our immune systems are strong, those yeasts are not really all that bothersome, but it's when we're immunosuppressed that these yeasts become opportunists and start to inhabit these areas and start to create problems. And one of the things, and we talked more in depth, and I won't go too in depth tonight about it, but we talked about how yeast overgrowth, yeast can produce proteins that mimic gluten exposure. So you can actually, if you're gluten-free and you've been 100% gluten-free, grain-free, but you have a yeast overgrowth, you can start behaving, your body can start behaving as if you're getting exposure. And another one, as I mentioned before, is oxalate intolerance, and that's because some yeast produce oxalates, and so potentially you're driving up oxalate production inside the body, where, remember what an oxalate is, it's a tiny microscopic crystal, and if those crystals are shooting through your body, not only do oxalates, can they form and bind with calcium to form kidney stones, but they can lodge in your tissue. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of times we'll see people with yeast overgrowth and high oxalate, they'll have muscle pain and aches and joint pain and aches, because those microscopic sharp crystals are lodging into their tissue, creating that inflammatory process and pain. A lot of times, let's blow this up here, because I get this a lot too when people go see like an allergist, and the allergist says, "Oh, there's no such thing as mycotoxin poisoning." So I just want to dismiss that, right out of the gate here. So this is not new research. This is published in 2003. So this is published in the journal Clinical Microbiology Reviews. So it's not like chump change science, folks. This is direct excerpt, right? So we have mycosis. What does mycosis mean? Mycosis refers to the yeast. Let's bring that back up. We lost it. Mycosis refers to the yeast. Okay, so yeast directly, right? So mycosis. Whereas down here, you can see in contrast to mycoses, you have mycotoxicosis. So mycotoxicosis is when you're poisoned by mycotoxins, okay? Poisoning by natural means. This is mycotoxicosis. That's this. And then you have mycosis here, which is the actual growth of the fungus on you. Okay, so again, mycosis range from merely annoying athlete's foot, which is mold growing between the webs of your feet, to life-threatening invasive, let's make room for that, aspergillosis, which is aspergillus is a type of mold, and aspergillosis is when it grows inside of you and it can kill you. So the fungi that cause mycosis can be divided into two categories: primary pathogens, which are some of the types that we commonly see in super sick people, and opportunistic pathogens. Opportunists like Aspergillus and Candida are pretty common, whereas these other ones can be quite dangerous. These ones generally are opportunists, but when you have somebody who's immunosuppressed, these opportunists can become major problems. And so you can see primary pathogens affect otherwise healthy individuals with normal immune systems, meaning coccidioides and histoplasma can affect healthy people, whereas things like Aspergillus and Candida generally affect people who have compromised immune systems. Well, what compromises immune systems is mycotoxins, right? We get immunosuppression. So this is why it's so important to understand. This is kind of a 1-2 punch a lot of times. So you see down here, in contrast to mycosis, mycotoxicosis, examples of poisoning by natural means, and thus are analogous to the pathologies caused by exposure to pesticides and heavy metal residues. And so you'll see a lot of overlap between people exposed to pesticides or heavy metal chemical contaminants because mycotoxins are poisons to humans, no matter who you are. There's a lot of talk about some people are more susceptible to mold than others, and yes, that's true. But when it comes to mycotoxins, mycotoxins are poisons to all of you, right? And so it's not about who's more susceptible, who's less susceptible, as much as is heavy burdens of heavy metals poison to all of you. Heavy burden of pesticide is poison to all of you. Well, heavy burden of mycotoxins is poison to all of you, and it's just important to grasp that difference. So part of it depends on the type of mycotoxin, the amount and duration of exposure. We talked a lot about this last week, the age, the health, the sex of the exposed individual, and many poorly understood synergistic effects involving genetics, dietary status, interactions with other toxic issues, etc. So the other thing you can see, thus the severity of mycotoxin poisoning can be compounded by factors such as vitamin deficiencies, why it's so important for your doctor to measure this, caloric deprivation, are you eating enough food, okay, alcohol abuse, infectious disease status. In turn, mycotoxicosis can heighten vulnerability to microbial disease, worsen the effects of malnutrition, and interact synergistically with other toxins. So mycotoxins, when you're exposed to high levels, you're exposed to other toxins just generally in your environment, but when you're also exposed to mycotoxins at high levels, it's going to deteriorate you at a much more rapid pace. So important to see that. What I was telling you earlier about oxalate. So here we have, just want to show you very quickly here, evidence for a cytoplasmic pathway of oxalate biosynthesis in Aspergillus. So again, when we talk about the mold growing on you and in you, we're talking about its ability to make oxalates, and that potentially increase in oxalate can come with its own set of symptoms, oxalate toxicity. So important to understand that mold, again, mold can do that. And it's just one more level or layer of why doctors and why people get so confused around this issue. Let's talk about a third way that mold can impact you, and that's through an allergic response. Now, this is the one that most doctors agree with. They'll say, yeah, you can be allergic to mold. So you go to the GI doctor, or not the GI, but the immunologist or the allergy doctor, and generally they'll measure you for what's called an IgE, right, reaction, which is the kind of the classic hallmark symptoms of allergy. The itchy eyes, the sneezing, wheezing, coughing, the histamine release. That would be like hives on the skin or rashes on the skin, and histamine intolerances, right? So this is IgE. And so, but look here, there's IgG and there's IgA that can also occur. You can be having an immune response to mold in these ways. It's not just IgE. So again, if you go to the allergist, they typically, all they measure is this. They usually only measure that pathway. They're not, I've talked to allergists. These are guys that were trained in medical school, tell me that they don't believe that people can have IgG or IgA reactions. I'm like, you're an allergist. How could you not believe that? It's crazy. But it's the reality, right? So IgE is what generally gets measured. And if you don't have that acute response, that classic response, then they dismiss it, right? So all those other things we just talked about, yeast overgrowth and mycotoxin poisoning, not being measured, just completely dismissed, right? It's just a very non-comprehensive approach to the issue around mold, right? And then you get IgG and IgA responses, and these generally form what are called antigen antibody complexes. And these antigen antibody complexes, they form and they create chronic systemic inflammation once they go through, and it's common to affect the gut, the nerves, the joints, and the brain. And although some people would connect the brain and the nerves together, I'm talking about peripheral nerves. I've seen peripheral neuropathy in people with mold problems, but also things like brain fog and early onset dementia, memory loss, things like that can happen. And I want to show you this because, again, we have this mantra nowadays in the media, follow the science, right? And so here's science, real study showing moist and mold exposure is associated with high prevalence of neurological symptoms, okay, in a Finnish hospital cohort. So okay, what does that mean? So let's look at the results of this particular study. The symptoms of the central or peripheral nervous system were also more common in study versus control cohort, 81 versus 11%. Fatigue was reported in 77 versus 24%. So in the mold-exposed people, fatigue was common 77% of the time. Okay? Multiple chemical sensitivity in 40% versus 9% of non-mold exposed. Okay? Brain fog was prevalent in 62% versus 11%. Arrhythmias, heart arrhythmias, in 57% versus 2.4%. And what is a heart arrhythmia? It's neurological. A lot of people think a heart arrhythmia is the problem with the heart. What's inside your heart? The third largest nervous system in the body is inside your heart, right? And so these are neurological issues manifesting as the arrhythmia, right? And then musculoskeletal pain in 51 versus 22% among participants of the study versus control. So the reason I say this is it's common practice in medicine to say, if you have a mold problem, you're going to have coughing, wheezing, sneezing, watery, teary, itchy eyes. And if you don't have those things, get out of my office because you don't have a mold problem. You're crazy and you're sick in the head and you're depressed and you need to go see a psychiatrist. That's super common, right? Not true. Not true, right? Follow the science. This study was published in 2020. This is not we'll just say it like this: if your doctor doesn't want to read the literature, because this is 2020, so it's not super new, but it's not super old. If your doctor's not staying abreast of the literature in the area, they're going to dismiss you and they're going to gaslight you and make you think that it's really you have a problem because they have an insufficiency to figure out why you're sick. And so don't let them do that to you, because mold can affect you in more ways than just the classic symptoms of allergy. And I get sick of it because I see so many people who are so sick and they could have been helped years earlier if they just had a doctor that would look at this a little bit more closely. Something else I want to show you here. So the impact of fungi on immune responses, because going back to what we're talking about, spores and fungal fragments found in indoor and outdoor environments originate from opportunistic fungi, and they can contribute to inflammatory responses, causing a broad range of symptoms. Fungi can bind to antibodies and complement them, allowing them to be recognized by cells of the innate immune system, including macrophages, dendritic cells, and mast cells. That's what MC stands for, which are then stimulated via toll-like receptor signaling. Fungi can cause diseases mediated by mast cells and aggravate their allergic inflammation. So this is different. This is a little different than just this. What we're really talking about is this over here, right? The part that most doctors ignore is what this study is referring to, and that's what I want you to understand. And so you see here again, immunosuppressed subjects can be particularly susceptible to developing diseases caused by opportunistic fungi. Mold also liberates mycotoxins, which we talked about, that could be on volatile spores and stimulate mast cells to secrete pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. Okay, so this is not in your head. If you are in mold, if you've got a mold problem, if your doctor's not willing to help you figure it out, it's not because he's so intelligent and smart, or she's so intelligent and so smart. It's generally because they give up. They don't they don't believe in it, right? And they can't help something they don't believe in. And that's the unfortunate truth, around a lot of this, because a lot of people struggle with chronic mold issues, and they never get an opportunity to even properly get it investigated. So again, tonight, the synopsis is, I've given you some labs that most doctors will run. If you see some of those patterns that we discussed within those labs, you might think a little bit heavier to suspect mold. And then that might allow you then to pursue more aggressive testing for mold, like mycotoxin testing, to get a more confirmatory answer. And go back and watch last week, because we talked a lot about mold inspection and what some of the do's and don'ts and what to look for in that regard. So now let's take your questions. So, okay, so is it only current exposures that matter, or can it be previous exposures? Experts seem to differ. So if you're talking about mold, if you're allergic to mold, current exposure is where it's at. Like if you get current ongoing exposure to mold, current exposure is going to have a direct effect on your health, right? Especially, again, if you're allergic. Now, if you're talking about mycotoxins, you're not going to be sick because you have mycotoxins floating in you from 5 years ago. So it depends on which one you're talking about. So mycotoxins, most of them have a half-life of about 30 days, give or take. And then their antigen-antibody complexes have a half-life of several months. So if you are out of mold and out of mycotoxin exposure, generally speaking, most people notice a difference in the way that they feel, depending on, again, other variables. But anywhere between 2 and 3 months, we start seeing, a pretty good change. But let's say you were in mold 5 years ago and you've been out of mold for 5 years. You're not still sick because you were in mold 5 years ago, unless you're still in mold today. So I wouldn't say to that question, I wouldn't say it's so much past exposure, although past exposure can deteriorate your health. And if you never recovered from your past exposure, meaning you never made a comeback, then being re-exposed to mold, currently could also be contributing to that. So but generally, no, it's not past exposure as much as it's current exposure. Symptoms of histamine level issues. Linda, I'm going to put a link up for you in the feed on histamine. I did an entire hour and a half on histamine. I don't want to give you too little information. I'll give you a solid clip of information that you can go back and access. So look for that in your feed. Okay, so Robbie says, this is so interesting. I have been told by a serum mold panel that my levels are off the charts. However, I have had only 2 of these symptoms, being we found mold in our house from a leaky pipe years ago. It was repaired and I have had chemical sensitivity. Yeah, so I didn't see the question in that. But yeah, I mean, if you're talking about serum mold panel, that's probably mold antibodies. You were probably being checked for mold antibodies, which is fine. Mold antibody testing can be important. But it may not be showing you everything you need to see. Can you recommend some good mycotoxin aflatoxin tests for people to have done? I mean, there's several different companies that'll do it. Probably one of the best is Real Time Labs here in Texas, just for accuracy's sake. You also have to, around those types of tests, sometimes you can get a false negative, even on that one. Sometimes they need to be done under provocation. So provoking mycotoxins out of you sometimes is necessary to find a positive result. Does ibuprofen increase histamine? No, ibuprofen damages the GI tract, potentially making you more susceptible, but doesn't increase histamine directly. You may have had a negative reaction to ibuprofen for other reasons, but no, it's not generally something that causes a histamine storm. Now, you can get it in some of people that take ibuprofen that are contaminated with gluten. I've seen that be the case if you're incredibly allergic to the fillers in the ibuprofen. Does mold cause CIRS? C-I-R-S. Every doctor tells me I'm chronically inflamed, but they can never tell me why. Mold can, Amanda. So CIRS, for those of you, maybe some of you have never heard that term. It stands for chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and it's kind of a generic term. Very generic, in my opinion. Chronic inflammatory response syndrome, because the big question mark, as Amanda so succinctly put, is where is the inflammation coming from? Why, right? What are the causes of inflammation? We got food, we got chemical exposures. Mold is a chemical. Mold toxins are a chemical, so that would really fall into that category. We've got microbial imbalance, So although mycotoxin falls under chemical, mold falls under microbial imbalance. And then we have another trigger, which is nutritional status, vitamin and mineral status, or more specifically, nutritional deficits. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4 primary drivers of inflammation. So if we're talking about a disease that's called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, you're chronically being inflamed and responding, and so over time your body just continues to deteriorate. Why? That is true. Why? We want to know the why, because just understanding that you have that diagnosis doesn't really help you if these things are not being measured. And that's why it's so important when you're working with your doctor that these things are looked at aggressively and with with accuracy. And that's the important part of it. If you have black mold on the wall, you wash with bleach? No, not unless you just want to bleach the mold and make it not black anymore. Bleach doesn't kill mold. Bleach is 97% water. What does mold need to grow? It needs water. So if you pour a bunch of bleach on your sheetrock, which is nothing but mold food, you're putting sheetrock plus 97% water, and you're going to propagate mold. You'll bleach the mold that's there, meaning you'll turn it from black to white, so you won't see it anymore, but it doesn't mean it's gone. Bleach doesn't kill mold. Chlorine doesn't kill mold. It's a waste. It's one of the worst things you can do, because then it's out of sight, out of mind. What do you clean black mold with then? Well, depending on the problem, if you see a little black mold in like your shower grout and you're cleaning your shower and there's a little bit of mold, you want to use a mold cleaner. Probably one of the best things to clean it with is hydrogen peroxide and essential oils. Those things can work really, really well together at killing mold. But thieves oil, there's a brand called Thieves Oil that they make actually a mold mitigation solution that can work really well in that regard. There are other industrial mold cleaners that are designed to kill mold, but many of those are toxic, and so you have to weigh their toxicity versus whether or not you want to use them. Are there some fruits safer than others compared to others that you would recommend eating to avoid mold? I mean, mainly it's from a fruit perspective, it's how fresh is the fruit. If you can see mold growing on it, don't eat it. Some people just cut the fruit and eat the mold anyway, or eat the parts of the mold they can't see, not knowing they're eating it. But it's just best to eat it fresh. Let's see, how to control or eliminate chronic symptoms of yeast overgrowth. There's a lot of ways, Helena, to go about doing that. But I think the first and most important is to identify why it's growing in the first place. Like, what's creating the immunosuppression issue that's causing the overgrowth? Start here. Now, if you don't have a doctor or you don't know where to begin, because this requires investigation and generally requires a doctor to work with you, another good place to start is no grain, no pain. Start with that. Start with the diet. Because a lot of times the reason mold continues to propagate is that you continue to feed it. A lot of people don't realize that mold is like the stray cat that comes back you put the bowl of milk out on the porch and the cat keeps coming back. And that's what happens is people feed the mold. They feed it. How do we feed mold? Alcohol, sugar, simple carbohydrates are all things that will feed mold. Can mercury from dental amalgams make it harder to detox from mold? Look, yes, anything that is degradatory to your health, if you've got other health issues and it compromises your body's ability to deal or cope with something, including mold, then the answer is yes, but that doesn't make it a hopeless scenario. Let's see, keep going down on that side. Yeah, so go back up just a little bit. Claire's saying, I have no allergy symptoms, just severe fatigue, keeping me in bed and affecting my knees. Never had joint pain before. I think it was Dr. Brewer. He's a researcher on, he studies chronic fatigue syndrome, He did a study one year, published his data, and I can't remember, don't quote me on this, but I want to say it was somewhere in the neighborhood of if 90% of the patients that he tested with chronic fatigue syndrome had mold toxin, mycotoxin elevations in their testing. So that would be something to think about if you're struggling with chronic fatigue. It's one of those that I've seen very, very similar. As a lot of people I've seen with chronic fatigue, generally they have mycotoxicosis, which is part of their problem. Okay, keep going down. Can mold lead to hypermobility? Well, there's a condition called Ehlers-Danlos, and I've seen cases where people had gluten exacerbated it, mold exacerbated it, heavy metal exacerbated it, but I don't know that it necessarily is the cause of that. It's just one of those things I think that can contribute to making it worse. Hi, Dr. Osborne. I live in a subsidized moldy home and can't have money for full rent elsewhere. What can I do to prevent this mold to continue deteriorating my health? Angeline, I feel for you, but you got to get out of the mold. There's only one solution to mold, and that's get out of it. There's no amount of detoxification. There's no amount of air purification or, essential oil diffusion or any other trick, liver detox pill, anything, nothing is going to stop the mold from deteriorating your health if you're living in it. You can't, imagine, it's like a fish swimming in a poisoned fish tank. They're not going to be healthy. You can feed them organic food. You can give them fish vitamins. They're going to be sick because they're swimming in poison. If you live in a poisonous environment, you're going to stay poisoned. And that's where, you've got to find a way to get yourself out of there as soon as you can. Is there a connection between toxic mold and cancer? Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, yes. We're certain of that. Molds cause cancer. Let's see. We have 2 HEPA filters. Is that enough to control the effects of mold? I live in an old rental. Moving isn't an option. So not if you have mold. Look, a HEPA is not going to stop mold. The only thing that's going to stop mold is doing a full-blown remediation. You have to stop it for the reason. Why does mold grow? So very simply put, mold grows because you get moisture and food. These 2 things, mold grows. If you don't solve for the moisture and the food, then you're not going to solve the problem. Now, the food is the building material in many cases, right? The wood, the sheetrock, the wallpaper, whatever's used. So you really can't control for the food because it's the building material itself. Harder to control there, but you can control the moisture. This is the holy grail. And so where does the moisture come from? Well, it depends. This is where, it takes a degree of investigation to understand why there's moisture there. And so maybe it is a leak. Maybe it's construction defect. Maybe it's condensation. This is very common in basements to see the water barrier of a house be damaged and moisture's coming into the basement, leading to mold growth, and that mold growth is now facilitating throughout the entire home. That moisture problem has to be solved. You can put a HEPA filter. What does a HEPA do? HEPA, high efficiency particulate filters, what do? They will capture circulating mold spores. That's it. They'll capture them. Okay, but if you have a source of moisture in food, guess what mold spores do? They replicate. They don't quit replicating. They keep replicating. So you can capture some, and you will with a HEPA filter, but it isn't going to stop the replication. And if you don't stop the replication, it doesn't matter. This is like it's like having 8 holes in your boat, and instead of plugging the holes, you're trying to row to shore. Eventually, your arms are going to get tired, and the boat's going to sink. You have to plug the holes. You have to stop the moisture in this case, or nothing's going to be effective. HEPA is a stopgap, but it isn't a solution. It's not a solution. Neither are foggers. Some people do mold foggers, like mold bombs. If you don't solve for the moisture, this is a temporary. It will not work. You'll spend a lot of money and poison your house, potentially poison yourself to a certain degree. But if you didn't deal with the moisture, it isn't going to do anything. Some people will do like clean the ducts. Let's clean the ducts because maybe it's in the ducts. We're not sure. Well, let's look at cleaning the ducts. This is not going to stop the moisture problem. If you've got mold in the ducts and it grew in there originally because of moisture, cleaning that is not going to stop the mold from coming back after you clean it. So, you can buy an air filter and that's great. It's good to have cleaner air. It's good to clean your air, but if you've got a moisture problem that's leading to mold, it's not going to solve for that. And so a lot of people say, well, I'm going to do my best. If you're in toxic mold and you're chronically sick, you're going to die in that house. You got to remediate the reason why the mold is growing if mold is your problem. You cannot HEPA filter it, you can't bomb it, you can't fog it, you can't wipe it away and hope that it doesn't come back. Remember, mold is microscopic. So if it's growing to a level where you can see it, you have a major problem. And 2, if it's a lot of times it doesn't grow to the level where you can actually visualize it because it can be behind your walls. Mold is microscopic in size, and mycotoxins are even smaller. They're about 0.2 microns in size, which that's hundreds of thousands of them that you could fit on the tip of this little pen here. I mean, we're talking about tiny, and they solubilize into your air. So once they hit the air, boom, they go everywhere. So you don't want to. You don't want to mess around with it if you've got mold in the home. Even if moving is not an option, moving may not be an option, but remediation should be an option. Investigating where the moisture is coming from so you can solve for that problem. Can mold cause flaky rash on the eyebrows and forehead? Yes, it can. Other things can as well, but mold definitely can. Does nasal saline rinse with a drop of iodine kill mold in the nasal passage? Iodine is a natural antifungal antibiotic, and saline helps to drain, and so that might be somewhat helpful. But if you've got a nasal mold overgrowth, but in my experience, most people with a nasal mold overgrowth are immunocompromised because they're in mold. It's super common to see repetitive sinus infections coming repetitively over and over and over again because the person is immunosuppressed and in mold. And so no amount of neti pot rinses with saline or iodine is going to solve for that if you're living in the mold. I want to emphasize that if you're in mold, the solution is to get out of the mold or to remediate the mold. There aren't other solutions. Those are the 2 solutions. Is it possible to see fungus on the stomach that looks like dark blueberry circles in clusters in the upper right part of the stomach? I'd have to see a picture of that. There's a lot of strange things that can show up on the skin, but I'd have to see a picture of that to understand better what you're describing. I was just diagnosed with Sears and cannot take pharmaceuticals because I'm already poisoned with Cipro. Okay, no question there, just a comment. What about vinegar to kill mold? No, vinegar's not going to kill mold. Can mold be the root cause of chronic fatigue syndrome? I think I answered that a moment ago. It can be, absolutely. What about Everclear vodka to clean with? No, I wouldn't use alcohol to try to clean up mold. I would, if you're trying to clean up mold, you need to use something that has proven objective scientific validity for actually stopping the mold and killing the mold. One of the things that works really well, and it's used by the food industry, is different essential oils can be very effective, especially citrus. They use it all the time in the food preservation industry to prevent mold from growing on food that's processed. So, Sally, too broad of a question on inherited CBS gene and advice how to detox, because, detox from what? There are a number of different things, and there's no such thing as a general detox so much. And if you've got a CBS, which type of CBS mutation do you have? There's just too much to unpack there. My histamine question just has to do with, does your body overreact with symptoms due to mold exposure, thus coughing and sinus issues? It can, but that's not the only way that your body can react with a histamine problem. There are a lot of different ways that your body can react to excessive histamine, and one of them is GI dysfunction. Another one of them is not being able to go to sleep. Histamine's a stimulatory neurotransmitter. So if you're not breaking it down and you're being exposed, it keeps you awake. That's why people that take Benadryl get really tired. It blocks histamine. Remember, histamine's a neurostimulant. Oh, so we were talking, so this is a great question. Wonder what to do in certain parts of the planet where the air humidity is so high, the wardrobes seem to be an uncontrollable mold nursery. Yeah, this is where you can use citrus oils and other things like that with your clothing. But if we're talking about mold prevention, because we didn't really talk much about mold prevention. One of the things we can do for mold prevention, this is saying that you don't have a mold problem and you don't want to get a mold problem, right? And let's say your house is properly built, then yes, HEPA filters are great for prevention. The dehumidification of your home, so dehumidify. And so what do we shoot for in a home? We shoot between 40 and 50% humidity. It's a 5. If it starts to get above 55%, you increase the risk for mold growing. You clean any water immediately, any water spills, water damage immediately to try to prevent an issue. These are preventative. What some people do preventative is they diffuse essential oil. There are a number of different types of essential oils that have been shown to be anti-mold proliferating, and so citrus is a good family. Thymol is good. There's a number. Cinnamon and clove have been shown to have antifungal properties. So there's a number of different natural, again, preventative. We're not talking about to get rid of it if you have it. We're talking about prevention, right? So dehumidify to 40 to 50%. Now, a good AC unit, if it's connected properly, will do this for you, right? But if you don't have that, and I have some people like in South America where it's very humid, where this was part of their solution, right? Was to purchase dehumidifier, plug it in to keep the humidity lower in the home, because humidity is a bigger problem when you're near a rainforest. But again, it's control for the moisture, right? And control for the moisture and capture spores that are circulating that could become a problem should there be enough moisture. So this is preventative, right? Dehumidification is preventative. Those are two of the best things that you can do to keep it from becoming a problem. I recommend a question about what do you recommend to control the moisture? Well, your AC unit and your heater will if you keep them running. But, again, you need a hygrometer to measure your humidity in your home. And if it's, even with the AC working and the heater on, depending on the time of the year it is, if your humidity level is still 55% or higher, you need to get a dehumidifier for your house. And so you can go to Home Depot, Lowe's, you can go to a hardware store and you can pick up a dehumidifier. The key is to test the humidity in the home, and I would test different rooms to see, because sometimes there's a room like with a window and an air issue, so humidity is getting into that room a little bit easier. Not every room in the house is going to be exactly the same. If I live in a very dry climate and my house is 100 years old, how much should I worry about mold infestation? As much as anyone else. So the myth is that mold only propagates with the humidity. The mold spores they're waiting for if you live in an arid climate, like in the U.S., like Arizona, New Mexico, mold is just waiting for the water. And if you live in a really hot, arid climate where you're running an AC inside, your house it creates a tin can, it can create a tin can effect where moisture, if you ever take a temperature differential from the outside to the inside, if the air inside the house is 30 degrees cooler than the air outside the house, and you have the potential to create moisture condensation. And so if you live in an arid, dry climate, that can still happen. So part of it is your construction. It's why construction being done properly is so important. How to spot mold in a new house. If it's not obvious, this is where I recommend before you buy one is hire a mold inspector before you sign on the dotted line. Does clove oil kill mold? It can. It can. Clove is one that's oftentimes used in formulations as well. So Melissa's asking, what preventatives can we use in a new build? You're building a new house. I think more than anything, it's make sure that your architect that's designing your plans, like if you're building a new house and you're designing a new house, the architect should be mold knowledgeable. Let's put it like that. They shouldn't be ignorant to the fact that mold and water intrusion can be a problem. So a mold literate architect would be one of the best things that you can do. And also I would have, if you're building, I would have a liaison that you hire independently of the contractor that you're working with, who's there to protect you each step and doing inspections to prevent major mistakes from occurring during your build. It's worthwhile to spend that extra money to do that, because if you get into a house that has a mold problem, you've arguably for most people, you've lost your biggest investment, possibly to mold damage. I love that. Linda says, thanks for the connection between histamine and stomach problems and staying awake all night. I love that you made that connection, Linda, and that hopefully will get you moving in the right direction. Does tea tree oil work on mold? It can. When mold fungus is physically visible in multiple areas of the body, if antifungal oils are applied and herbs are eaten, what could be done to prevent die-off circulating through blood-brain barrier? So you're talking about two different things. If you've got mold growing on you, or you've got mold growing in you, because when you talk about die-off, you're talking about internally. Die-off is happening internally. If die-off is happening externally, you generally won't have a ton of symptoms that you'll have to mitigate. But if die-off of mold is happening internally because you're eating herbals that are antifungal, one of the best things that you can do, you're not going to prevent die-off, but you can use different kind of binding agents to help with that. We use actually something called Mycobinder Plus, and it's a mixture of zeolites and charcoals, and that can be effective at helping prevent recirculation of toxic die-off. You also make sure that you have you're pooping normally, that you're peeing regularly, staying plenty hydrated, lots of water, and make sure that you're sweating on the regular. These are also exit strategies for the die-off biotoxins. Remember, they got to go somewhere, and they generally come out through detoxification, through your skin, through your urine, or through your stool. Our apartment is very dry due to the heaters being turned on. Are there molds that grow in dry environments? Yeah, again, I'll say that mold can grow. Even if you live in a dry environment, it doesn't mean that there's not a potential condensation or moisture problem. And I don't say that to scare everybody listening tonight, thinking, oh no, lose sleep over whether or not there's moisture. But look, the real issue is if you're struggling with your health and you don't know why in your diet, and you are no grain, no pain clean in your diet, this needs to be something that you're considering. You need to be thinking about the potential for mold. Doesn't matter the climate, doesn't matter how dry you think it is. I've seen cases where had somebody living in Arizona, some of the worst mold I've ever seen, a super dry climate. So I don't look at that as a disqualifier for the potential for mold to grow. Does mold grow on concrete or plaster walls? Yes, it does. Concrete is not a material that's foolproof for mold. No material is foolproof for mold. Mold can grow on anything. Mold can grow on metal. Oftentimes people say, well, it can't grow in the air ducts because the air ducts are not cellulose debris. It can grow in the air ducts. It does grow in the air ducts. So just be aware. Let's see. How long does it take to get mycotoxins out of your system? Well, if you're in an environment where you don't have mold exposure, right? That's the most important thing. So generally, depending on the quantity so where mycotoxins, a lot of them are lipophilic, meaning they store in your fat cells. So, what we'll see sometimes, especially in people who are overweight, is it takes longer because as they're losing weight through diet change and through other mechanisms, they're releasing toxins, but sometimes it's occurring a little bit more slowly. But as a general rule of thumb, my experience is 4 to 6 months. If you're talking about getting mycotoxins out of the body, 4 to 6 months is a general good goal to have. So I know some of you have said, I've been dealing with mold for years. Hopefully you haven't been trying to get mold toxins out of you for years because and you're not in mold anymore, because if that's the case, it's taking too long. You're doing it wrong. You're going about it incorrectly. You recommend brick or cement houses? I recommend neither one over the other. I recommend build what you want, but have the right team in place that understands the potential for mold to grow. I don't think brick is, I think one material I wouldn't choose is stucco, just because I've seen nightmares with stucco. Stucco's like a mold trap. But I don't necessarily think that brick is. I think if the home is built properly, I think you can build a good brick house. I think you can build a good concrete structure. It's about moisture. It's about moisture management, water management at the end of the day. Let's see here. What type of doc would have knowledge regarding eye, sinus, mold exposure causing vision issues? I would say look for, if you're looking specifically for an eye doctor, look potentially for an ophthalmologist that trains in functional medicine. I mean, at the end of the day, that is a doctor who's an expert in your eye and eye physiology. But if they're not trained functionally, then they're going to want to medicate you with things. And that's if that's not your philosophy. If you don't want to medicate with a steroid, let's say, or some other type of anti-inflammatory or immune suppressant, then that doctor doesn't matter whether they're an eye expert or not. If they don't match your philosophy, then it isn't going to work for you. So you got to find one that's functionally trained. I do, Mark. I do think Brandon has mold issues on his brain. I was told at Mayo Immunology that if I had CYP450 abnormalities and couldn't detox aflatoxin B1, it's pretty common. No, I would disagree with that. I think I think somebody misinformed you. What they did is they told you because your genes are broken and flawed, then it's impossible for your body to do its job, and that's nonsense. Your genes aren't a curse, they're a gift from God. And if you ever allow anybody to tell you that they're a curse, then you're sealing your fate to a predetermined illness. Do dryers get rid of mold on clothes? No, they don't. In washing machines, especially the front loaders are mold machines. Like, they are mold bags. I would say if you're in the market for a new washing machine, buy a top loader. Do not buy a front loader. A few years ago, I think they were suing, I can't remember if it was Whirlpool or GE, one of those companies, because the mold in the clothing, those front loaders were just creating huge mold problems. Lena says, I went to my doctor thinking my celiac was flaring, and must have accidentally eaten gluten, then found mold in my house, and we made the connection that had been stumping us. Love that. Thanks for sharing that, Lena. Not that you had to go through that, but glad you found the answer. How do frequencies affect mold growth? There's some preliminary studies that are showing that electromagnetic frequencies like Wi-Fi signals actually help mold grow. It actually helps mold proliferate more. So this is one of the connections that's sometimes discussed is EMF, right? EMF affecting a person's health. Certainly it can, but if you've got mold, EMF potentiating the possibility that mold can grow even better. Okay, I think we're right at the time here. We got more questions, but time's up. So I'm going to go home and eat dinner. Last one here. Paul's asking about gluten sensitivity testing for Australia. Yeah, we do. We ship those to Australia, so that's something you can get done, Paul. If you want to get genetically tested for gluten sensitivity, yes, we'll ship that. Just reach out to glutenology@gmail.com, and one of the ladies there can help you get that. So we're going to wrap this up. I hope you learned something new tonight. That's my job, is to bring you knowledge so that I can help you empower yourself to find and seek better health. We're going to be talking about mold again next week, mold part 3 next week, just another deep dive into some of the areas that we didn't have time to get into tonight. And then we'll be talking about iodine. So some of you asked me, why aren't you talking about iodine? That's a couple weeks from now. So if you want to learn more about iodine and its impact on good health, we'll be talking about that in a couple weeks. So next week is part 3 of mold. And just so you guys also know, we're working on a documentary. It's a very, very large project that we're working on all about mold. It's going to be much more in depth. So if you're familiar with my Glutenology Masterclass, this is going to be as an in-depth, if not more in-depth, endeavor into mold, the toxicology of mycotoxins, remediation, construction defects, and so much more. So be patient with me. We're trying to get that resource put together for you as quickly as possible. Like I said, I think mold is the next wave of mysterious illness that many people are going to be dealing with as the construction industry throws houses up too quickly and without skilled labor. So have a great week. We'll see you next Monday for another episode of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. And hey, make sure if you found value in this, share this with somebody you know. Help us fight the censorship. The only way we're going to get it out there is through you helping to share it. So share it. Hashtag save 100 million lives. We'll see you next Monday. Take care. Hey, don't forget to tune in next week, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, for another Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain show. Bring all your toughest health questions to me. I look forward to answering them. And before you leave today, make sure you hit subscribe. And once you do, click that bell. That bell is going to allow us to remind you right before we go live. But it's also going to allow us to remind you when we come out with other video content all week long. We've got lots of episodes coming your way all week long, and I don't want you to miss anything. So again, subscribe, hit that bell so that you can get notified when we have that new information put up for you. Thanks so much, and I'm wishing you excellent health. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night.